Hello again, and welcome to another day of daily Bible study. Today, we're not really going to look at a text, and it kind of breaks my heart to have a daily Bible study where we're not looking specifically at a text of Scripture. But the letter to the Hebrews is such an interesting and unique letter in the Bible that it is worth taking some time and understanding some of the background material, just because it'll help to understand why it has the place that it has in the Bible and in history, and also to begin to prepare the way for understanding some of the specific things that go on in it. And so the first thing is that there's a question as to whether it is a letter in the usual sense, in the same way that Galatians is a letter. It's very clearly, Galatians is a letter in the sense that it's clearly written by a specific person to a specific person at a specific time with specific issues in place, and the whole idea is to address those issues. With the Hebrews, you don't have hardly any of the things that go along with letters. We don't have any kind of introduction. We don't have a statement of sender. We don't have a statement of recipients. I don't think there's even. I'm going to flip to the end here. I don't think there's even. There's not a closing benediction, a closing sign-off in the same way that you get in any of the other letters. And so it has been suggested that perhaps it's not, to call it the letter to the Hebrews is not really accurate, that it actually is much more of a sermon. It's an exhortation. It is probably the most sustained bit of exegetical work in the entire New Testament, that is looking at specific texts and trying to draw conclusions from them. Paul does a fair amount of that, so it's not the only case of it, but it's doing a lot of work in passages that are not always well known by Christians today. And so it's helpful to realize that. Another thing that's important to recognize is, as far as we know, Hebrews is anonymous. We do not know who wrote Hebrews. There are letters, I think I mentioned before, and I don't mean to make too much of this, but just so you're aware of the fact that some people say these kinds of things. There are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, and there are 8 of which that are largely, almost unanimously considered to have been authentically Paul wrote those. There are 7 more for which there is one degree of doubt or another. But some of those, for example, like Ephesians, we were just talking about, that general consensus is shifting, that more and more biblical scholars are coming to the conclusion that, in fact, Paul wrote that. And so we may find that over the course of the years, we may find that distinction between what they call the undisputed Pauline letters and the disputed ones may actually start to narrow. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know who wrote Hebrews. There has been a long tradition in the church, though, to suggest that Paul wrote Hebrews. There have even been some leaders throughout history who have said, if Paul wrote Hebrews, then it's Scripture. And if Paul didn't write Hebrews, it's not Scripture. It doesn't belong in the Bible. And I don't know how they can make that argument, because we have all kinds of stuff in the New Testament that's not written by Paul. But as somebody who has spent a fair amount of time kind of digging into some of Paul's language and some of Paul's issues, and then also looked into the book of Hebrews, to me it seems unlikely that Paul wrote it. Maybe if it was signed by Paul, I'd have to look at things differently. But the fact that we don't have any of the characteristic things that Paul usually did, and the fact that the style of writing is so very different than we see in Paul at any other point, leads me to think that probably the non-Pauline interpretation is correct. Now, so what does that mean? I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's in our canon. It was put there for a reason. And actually, it's one of the more helpful in understanding what you could call the metaphysics of atonement. What is really going on in atonement. And what I have found, and this is part of why I bring this up, is that that Hebrews, if we pay careful attention to Hebrews, you may find it is saying somewhat different things about how atonement works than we may be normally used to in the church. We tend to have a very narrow vision of what it means for God to save, and it usually is pretty exclusively focused on the cross. And for Hebrews, we're going to find that the cross is extremely important. But at the end of the day, it is a means to an end, that there's something deeper going on there. And the reason why I bring that up is because when we were in St. Andrews, we had, for the second semester we were up there, my supervisor was in charge of organizing the theology seminars. And in doing that, one of the things he did for at least the first couple of sessions was to invite New Testament scholars from the faculty to come and talk about what are the theological implications of their work. And so trying to foster this conversation between the two fields of theology and biblical scholarship, which are not as closely in conversation in general as you might expect. So the first person we had was N.T. Wright, who is, without doubt, one of the most important New Testament scholars, certainly of this century, if not of all time. But anyway, the second week is what really blew my mind was a guy named David Moffat, who's an American who did his PhD at Duke and then started teaching at St. Andrews. And apparently he wrote a book on Hebrews that has basically shifted the whole way people understand the letter, or the book, the letter, whatever it is. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is because I'm going to draw on a lot of what he has to say, because his one lecture, I mean, I made a recording of it, and when I came home, I told Allie, I said, we have got to watch this. We have got to listen to this, because this was incredible. And so we would listen to it while we were doing dishes, and in the middle of doing dishes and just listening to this presentation again, Allie was frequently struck by how significant it was, and it was fascinating. I mean, a life-changing lecture, and it's really helped to deepen my understanding of what's going on in Hebrews, what's going on in Atonement, and it's fascinating. So I refer to it a lot. But it's worth also noticing that the part of the reason why what he had to say was so important and why it was so revolutionary, because basically his key idea is if we want to understand Hebrews, we have to go back and look at the Old Testament, and specifically Leviticus, and even more specifically to look at the ritual for the Day of Atonement. So we're going to draw attention to that as well in our journey through Hebrews. And the reason why, so it shouldn't be revolutionary, because that's kind of what I think a lot of people would realize if you're familiar with that text. Well, the thing is, there was a time when you had kind of skeptical biblical scholarship, where people were, trying to dig into the Bible, at least in part. And one of the ways you scored academic points was to come up with some kind of, harebrained, crazy interpretation for how that maybe it wasn't what the church has always said it was. Like that was kind of the in thing. And I did an independent study on Hebrews in seminary, and one of the books I had to read for it was called The Wandering People of God. And it was a book that was talking about Hebrews, and basically it was saying that just like if you want to understand Paul, you have to understand the Pharisees. If you want to understand Hebrews, not the Old Testament, not the book of Leviticus, you have to understand ancient Greek language, mystery cults. So like the cult of Dionysius and all the rest. And I remember reading this going, this is bizarre. But it helped me understand why what this guy David Moffat said was so revolutionary, because in many ways he was simply bringing us back to looking again at what the original authors clearly knew. So I'm going to be drawing attention to a lot of these things, and I've never gone through Hebrews before. I did kind of highlights. Hebrews is one of those books that has kind of long chunks and is pretty tightly argued. So it's kind of like Romans in that respect, that you don't necessarily get like with Galatians or some of the other letters where you get a chunk, or like 1 Corinthians, where you have a chunk and then he changes topic and does this other chunk, or does several kind of related but very clearly distinct arguments. Like when we talk about the first passage for tomorrow, it's going to be the whole first chapter, because there's really no good breaking point, and he's making an integrated response. So I don't really know exactly what this is going to look like, how it might be different than some others, but I'm going to draw a lot of attention to what he is talking about. And I hope that even though some of the talk about how atonement works might seem strange, and it might almost seem revolutionary, or even, it may feel like an attack if it's different than you are used to thinking, I have been amazed at how thinking through Hebrews, the way David Moffat kind of walked us through it, has helped me understand a higher degree of integrity between the Old and New Testaments, a higher connection between how to think about atonement, and it actually really does, I think, give us a very robust and more reliable picture of what's going on, without actually undermining any of the key things that we normally believe about atonement. So I hope you enjoy this. I mean, it's really going to be an interesting journey, and I hope that you enjoy it with me. But come back again tomorrow, and we will begin looking at the letter, or for lack of a better word, the letter to the Hebrews. Have a good day.